After the surprising success of Resident Evil Outbreak, Capcom quickly saw the potential of this little co-op survival horror spin-off. I mentioned in my video talking about the original Outbreak that the game had more than 2/3 of its original content cut before release, and this is where Capcom knew that they could cash in on the unexpected success of the title. A couple months after the game's release, they went back to the team at Production Studio 1 and asked them if they could polish up and finish work on some of the unreleased scenarios from the first game so that they could be released as a standalone sequel. The men and women of Production Studio 1 were completely on board with the idea, with many of them naturally wanting to go back and finish a lot of that content that they had put so much time and effort into so that they could share it with the rest of the world. And since a lot of this work was already pretty far along by the time they had decided to make the sequel, Resident Evil Outbreak File 2 would be released to the world in September of 2004, less than 9 months after the release of the original. So would Outbreak File 2 manage to meaningfully build upon its predecessor to create the ultimate co-op survival horror experience, or would it fall victim to many of the original's issues? Well, let's talk about it. But before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 12th in a series of videos where I'm playing and reviewing every game in the Resident Evil franchise. You don't have to have seen the other videos in the series in order to enjoy this one, but I definitely recommend that you've at least seen my video on the first Outbreak game first, so that you can get a better understanding of how that game works and the context surrounding its release. So for those of you that are interested, I'll have the link to the full series in the description below for those of you that want to go check those out first. But with that out of the way, Resident Evil Outbreak File 2 is a standalone expansion for Resident Evil Outbreak developed and published by Capcom for the PlayStation 2 in 2004. And I'm sure a lot of you are wondering why I've split these games into 2 separate videos, since most people typically just lump them together. But I think you'll see as we go along that File 2 definitely does enough to deserve its own dedicated video in this series, even if it might be a bit of a shorter video than most. And much like my video on the first game, my good friend False was generous enough to sit down and play through this entire thing with me so that we could get the proper co-op experience. So just like what I talked about back then, make sure to go and check her channels out and show her some love for helping out. With all the preamble out of the way though, what is Outbreak File 2? Well, like I said before, it's a standalone expansion for the first Outbreak game, meaning that while it largely reuses the original game's core gameplay, all of the content here is completely new. And the standalone part comes from the fact that you don't have to own the first game and have played that first in order to play File 2, but it's definitely a better and more complete experience if you have. To start though, the game features 5 entirely new scenarios for players to play through, all of which were ones that got cut during the production of the first Outbreak game. So if you already owned a copy of the original, purchasing a copy of File 2 would quite literally double the amount of Outbreak content you had available to you. These scenarios all see the same group of survivors from Outbreak 1 escaping from the Raccoon City incident, but much like the first game, there isn't much of a story here. Once again, each scenario basically acts as its own little mini story, and there are little bits of lore scattered throughout for those who really want to get every last detail here, but there isn't any sort of overarching storyline that connects each individual scenario. This is still perfectly fine by me, as it's clear that the developers just wanted to make the best multiplayer experience possible, but I feel like it's at least worth mentioning that this would have been the perfect opportunity to try to flesh out the story of Outbreak just a little bit more. It would have been really nice to see them add a more satisfying narrative throughline here, and they probably could have retroactively tied things into the first game scenarios well enough to add some context to those as well. That being said, the first game didn't have much of a story, so in my opinion, it's not really worth complaining that the second one doesn't either. Fans of the original would already know what to expect going in, so this wouldn't really be much of an issue. One thing that I absolutely loved about File 2's scenarios is just how much more varied they are than the scenarios in Outbreak 1 were, and also just how much better they play than them. Don't get me wrong, Outbreak 1 already had some solid variety in its scenarios, but File 2's scenarios just feel much more creative and unique by comparison. To give those of you who haven't played File 2 a solid idea, the first scenario in the game takes place in the Raccoon City Zoo and sees players fighting off a large variety of T-virus infected animals while being chased around the map by a giant zombie elephant. The second feels much more similar to an Outbreak 1 scenario, with it being set in the Raccoon City subway system and seeing players trying to reactivate the train so they can make their escape. But then the third scenario has players running around the Arklay Mountains woods until they eventually come across an abandoned hospital where they're then chased around by a murderous Axeman while trying to find a way to destroy a giant T-virus infected plant. Then the fourth sees players returning to the RPD from RE2, and the fifth has us running around inside a secret Umbrella lab, fighting hunters alongside a friendly tyrant. So as you can see, the variety and the gimmicks in the scenarios here are absolutely S tier. And like I mentioned before, not only are these scenarios just conceptually more exciting, but they're also incredibly well executed. In Outbreak 1, I would say that I loved 2 of the game's 5 scenarios, felt like one of them was just okay, and actively disliked the other 2. Here in File 2 though, I loved 4 of the game's 5 scenarios, and thought that the remaining one was good, but just not one that I would want to play over and over again. Which, for the record, because I know some people will be wondering, that one was the final scenario in the Umbrella Lab for me, purely because it just felt like it was a bit too linear and played pretty much the exact same way every time we ran through it. It's still really cool, but it's just not one that I would want to play over and over. It's hard to describe, but it felt like the scenarios here had much stronger level design, much better pacing, and also just a lot more love poured into them than the first games did. I mean, seriously, the amount of enemy variety alone really just goes to show how much they wanted each scenario to feel special here. Every single scenario aside from the RPD has at least 1 or 2 unique enemies that were made just to fit the setting and theme of that specific scenario. And the RPD just uses iconic enemies from RE2 because nostalgia is one hell of a drug. On top of that, 3 of this game's 5 scenarios have multiple paths to completion and multiple unique endings for players to discover, whereas Outbreak 1 only had branching pathways like this in its final scenario. Now, that being said, no scenario here is totally perfect, and there are still some annoying spots where you'll have to deal with things like infinite zombie spawns and just other things that really rubbed me the wrong way in the first game. But I do have to say that these moments feel much more few and far between here. The scenarios of File 2 just felt much more intuitive, well-paced, and most importantly, fair compared to what we saw in the first game. And both myself and False felt like this made File 2 a lot easier to just hop on and play than the original was. But the scenarios aren't the only place where we see massive improvements in File 2, because they've also improved the overall game mechanics quite a bit here. Something that players familiar with Outbreak 1 will immediately realize is that every character now has an extra item in their inventory at the beginning of each scenario, with each of these new items further cementing each character's role in the overall sandbox. Kevin and Mark no longer start with just their pistols in their inventory, but they now also start with a loaded magazine for their respective pistols, meaning they're immediately able to start clearing zombies out to make things easier for other players. George used to start with just a medical kit that would allow him to turn herbs into medicines, but he now also starts with a capsule shooter that allows him to fire those medicines at his allies to heal them. And as a nice little bonus, every pill that you shoot out of this capsule shooter will now have its effects magnified as well. Yoko's backpack already made her one of the most useful characters in Outbreak 1, but she now also starts each scenario with a charm that reduces her infection rate by 30%, with her even being able to hand this charm off to other players to slow their infection rate down instead. This made Yoko so good in File 2 that I don't think False and I really ever even played without her on any of our runs, because say I wanted to play someone with a higher infection rate like Kevin. If she then played Yoko, she would have double the inventory space and could also just hand the charm over to me, and we would have way more time to explore and figure out how to get through the scenario. I could sit here and tell you about how every single character's extra item expands their importance in gameplay, but I think that those examples already give you guys a great idea of just how small yet impactful this edition really is. And that's only the first of a number of meaningful gameplay improvements. Another huge improvement for me, and for anyone else who's just getting into Outbreak for the first time, is that the virus gauge fills more slowly here in File 2. It's not gone entirely, so it does still force you to move quickly through scenarios, but it's been made a little more lenient so that newer players can get to grips with the game more easily. It made it way easier for False and I to get through the game's various scenarios in only 1 or 2 attempts each, and just generally makes the game a lot more enjoyable for those of us who haven't poured tens, if not hundreds of hours into these games already. Additionally, I'm not entirely sure about this one, but it seemed like there were a lot more healing items placed around the game's various scenarios. And since using a healing item in Outbreak temporarily freezes your virus gauge as well as giving you back some of your health, it's definitely more beginner friendly than the first game. And an amazing addition here is that there's now a training course in the single player mode that will teach you how to actually play Outbreak. But even with that increased forgiveness for new players, it's still a game that can be plenty challenging on the higher difficulties, and they even added a new Nightmare mode to offer an even greater challenge for Outbreak veterans. Nightmare mode can be applied to any difficulty, and it reduces the effectiveness of all healing items by 25%, as well as increasing enemy damage by 30%. So for those of you that are looking for the most difficult Outbreak experience possible, stacking the Nightmare mode on top of the very hard difficulty will give you exactly that. Something that I actually forgot to talk about in my first Outbreak video was the fact that every character in this game has at least one unique ability they can use. Some characters are capable of executing what's known as a pot shot, where they enter a special stance when using pistols for increased damage, and others are capable of dodging enemy attacks or tackling zombies to push them out of the way. These don't typically make a massive difference in your average playthrough, but they can be super helpful from time to time, and they've also gotten a bit of polish here. To start, they added some new abilities to certain characters that just weren't available in the original, and some abilities like Alyssa's dodge feel noticeably smoother here in File 2. They're improved to the point where I feel like going back to Outbreak 1 and playing some of my favorite characters like Alyssa would feel sort of janky by comparison, and it's another thing that just made me enjoy my time with File 2 that much more. Okay, so pausing the video real quick for a quick unscripted ramble because I just realized that something was in the game that I didn't know about until right at the end of editing the entire video. While editing, I found this random little clip of False actually walking while shooting an assault rifle, and it made me realize that there's a crazy new feature here that I didn't even know about. It turns out that Resident Evil Outbreak File 2 is actually the first game in the entire franchise where you can move while shooting. This applies to other weapons in the game too, like melee weapons where you can walk around and then just take a quick pause to swing, but as long as it's a firearm in File 2, you can actually walk around while shooting. And I wish that we knew about this sooner because as it turns out, being able to walk while shooting is kind of overpowered here since the entire Outbreak experience is built on the old system where you have to stand still. I was always under the impression that walking while shooting comes much later in the series, but as it turns out, it's right here. Alright, enough yapping, now back to the actual scripted part. And last but not least, File 2 also massively expands the bonus content. The original had a bunch of different character skins and even secret characters that you could unlock by beating certain challenges, and File 2 continues that tradition while also offering way more unlockable content than Outbreak 1. Additionally, there's a couple of entirely new game modes here, with the first of these being the new Elimination Mode. In Elimination Mode, you and your team will be spawned into a room from one of the existing scenarios and be given a 30-minute time limit to clear the map of all enemies. As you go through your first door though, you'll quickly notice that these maps are a disorienting mishmash of reused rooms from scenarios of both Outbreak 1 and 2. So you might spawn in the university scenario from the first game, but then when you go through a door, you'll suddenly be in the halls of the RPD. I wasn't really a fan of this mode, as it felt pretty confusing in terms of layout thanks to the dimension-shifting doors, and just kind of boring since all you're doing is searching for zombies and then shooting them once you find them. I'm sure there's someone out there who loves this mode, but it's just not really my thing. In a similar vein, there's Showdown Mode. In Showdown Mode, you'll load into a random boss fight from one of the two games, and after you defeat that boss, you'll be brought straight into another one. This cycle will then repeat a few times until you either die or just clear out all the bosses for that run. This one is definitely a bit cooler since boss rush modes are just really fun, and it does let you relive some of the bosses from Outbreak 1 with all the small improvements of File 2. That being said though, it's still a really simple addition that most people probably won't care about. It's definitely cool that it's here, but I just know that I personally won't be revisiting this or the Elimination Mode anytime soon. To wrap up this short little review though, I have to say that I enjoyed my time with Outbreak File 2 much more than I did my time with the first. It's basically just everything that already made Outbreak so damn cool, but polished up a good bit and without a single bad scenario in its lineup. The game is also much more forgiving to newer players like myself, but still offers those higher difficulties for experienced players who will be looking for a challenge. Now, of course, some of that might have just been that False and I were more prepared going into this one after already completing the original, so new players shouldn't expect that there won't be any struggle. But I definitely don't think it would be as hard to learn the game in File 2 as it was in File 1. Overall, I would say that Outbreak File 2 really is the ultimate co-op survival horror experience on the market. The original laid the foundations, but File 2 truly brings it all together in a satisfying way. I'm sure that the team could have improved the formula even more going forward, but unfortunately, this would be the last Outbreak title we ever received. I have no doubt that Capcom would have wanted to release some of the remaining 8 scenarios that we never saw if this were a success, but as far as the published sales data reveals to us, File 2 only sold about 200,000 copies, which when compared to Outbreak 1's nearly 1.5 million copies sold, you can see why Capcom quickly lost faith in the potential growth of the Outbreak brand. It's really unfortunate because it feels like File 2 was just really starting to hit its stride, and I would have loved to see them polish up this little gem even more over time. But as much as I hate to say it, it does make total sense why Capcom wouldn't want to risk funding another title. Maybe someday Capcom will gain the confidence they need to give us an entirely new Outbreak experience, but until that day, we at least have Outbreak 1 and 2 to look back on as some of the coolest Resident Evil spin-offs ever released. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Resident Evil Outbreak File 2 an 8.1. Hey guys, thanks for sticking around. As always, I have to give a massive thank you to the patrons and YouTube members who make this series possible. These guys add a very necessary safety net to a near 30 video deep dive into an iconic franchise like this, and I can't thank them enough. If you happen to be new around here and you're looking to dive deeper into this series or just the channel in general, then check out some of the stuff I'll have linked on screen. With that said though, I'm going to get back to work on the next video since that one is going to need some very special care. So goodbye for now, and I'll hope to see all of you right back here for the next Resident Evil review.